So one of the things I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is talk a little bit about this process of inquiry. Davis said that he's playing the mom role of telling you where that we have issues. And I think what's very important about that is there's a lot of nuance, even in the most simple of the metrics that Davis shared with you. Right? There's a lot of nuance in there, and he's the first person to talk about this. Real quickly, I want to show you something about this issue. We talk a lot about completion, and we use this as a metric. And we could talk for 90 minutes about what's in the denominator of a completion rate and what's in the numerator of a completion rate. Like, I can guarantee you we can get a completion rate to be either 20% or 70% in the community colleges, depending on decisions we make there. We have this debate in California. We have one number that a outside researcher, not anyone from CCRC, came in. They counted anyone who ever showed up on a college for the first time in the denominator, and only counted degrees and transfers. Degrees and certificates, not even transfer without a degree. You can get a rate down in the 20s, 18% if you do that. Our state chancellor's office, the version of your NCCCS, turned around and said, we're going to look at students who've come, they've taken 12 or more units, so we know they're here to do something, and they've tried transfer level math or English. We know those students are trying to get there. Now, of course, lots of students fall out before that. Then your transfer rate 65%. So there's a lot of nuance in the data, right? There's nuance from the decisions you make about what goes into the completion rate. Then on the top side, Davis was showing you in the stacked bar chart, which I think is a great way of looking at this, things like certificates of 1 year or more. There's a big question about certificates of 1 year or less, whether those should be included in overall metrics of completion. There's a question about how valuable some of those certificates are. Some of the times we have certificates that don't have market value. That's one of the concerns in including them. But it's another outcome for students that tends to be moving them in other directions, even though Davis just showed you data that sometimes they continue. But one of the things that most often happens when you sit in a room like this and you look at things like completion rates is, let's just say for a second our completion rate at College X, my old college, is 40%. And you're being asked, essentially, to raise that completion rate from 40% to 50%, or 40% to 55%. This is the type of thing we do in our strategic planning efforts these days on colleges. What we also tend to do, by the way, is make that type of statement, and then we all go back home to our offices. And most of the people who are going back to their offices have no idea what their role is in moving that number, right? If you're a faculty member in a classroom, if you're a student services professional on the side, moving completion sounds like a great idea. But there's not a lot, we don't do a lot to scaffold from that, what I would call a 30,000-foot metric of completion, down to what the world's like on the ground. And so we use this to kind of illustrate this point, was as you start unpacking a successful completion, what are the components that go into it? We could look at first-time students. You saw there's a huge difference on there in completion rates of first-time students who are straight from high school versus returning adults. Now there's some data nuance reasons for that we might explore. And one of the points I'm going to talk about is this process is really about asking better questions to get down to what's really going on at the ground. And marrying your expertise as practitioners, and most importantly, also bringing the expertise of everyone that you have on the ground to bear on this issue. Allison will talk about this tomorrow from an engagement standpoint. But I'll talk about it from an asking better questions about what's really going on standpoint. But we can kind of break it down, and we can look at other things that might affect completion. We're going to use this slide tomorrow to also talk about the next point, which is what the world really looks like to one of our students is more like this. This is what there's 2 points to this slide. One is we've let it be this chaotic for our students. If you don't think this is what the world looks like to our students, try tracking their steps through your campus sometime. Ask a student to write down, get a bunch of students together, ask them to write down the number of steps it took to get to day one, much less the end of the first semester, the end of the second semester, and all the decision points are on the way. We haven't really put a lot of effort into trying to streamline that, and the world ends up looking like this. But the other point of this slide is that there are lots of things we can study as you get down to the ground level and actually get some data on that we have on our campuses that can help us get back to trying to improve this overall completion rate. The world to your faculty is much closer on the ground if you're talking about some of these things that happen down here than you are about talking what happens up at the top there. And so this idea, so we've talked a lot in the last 10 years about building cultures of evidence. I have to say that I think this term is incredibly limited. And I come from industry, by the way. I was in industry in the late 90s during the whole explosion of the data and data analytics and use for improvement. This same exact thing happened in industry in the late 90s, which was, what we need is we need more data. We need more data. We need dashboards to show us the data, and magically something's going to get better. That was essentially the equation we've used. We did the same thing in the last 10 years in higher ed. We think it's about the data rather than being about the questions that the data helps us answer and what we then do with the data, right? And so the other point I would make is that at no point in human history has a data point made a decision. Data doesn't make decisions. We make decisions based on data, so evidence-based decision-making is an interesting idea. But what we're missing in that is that there will be a slide I'm about to show you in a minute, 100 and some odd people in this room. I guarantee you there's about 80 different interpretations of what's going on in that slide in people's heads. And too often what we do is we don't take the time to sit and actually explore what people think is going on here, maybe ask some questions that might actually get some additional data that will help us figure it out, and then use that data to move forward. So when this sounds like this idea of a culture of inquiry, sounds like this new agey California guy in a Hawaiian shirt telling you it's different. We need to have inquiry and yoga and other things, which we do. Yoga's great. But the point here is that what we tend to do is collect a lot of data, throw it in a lot of tables, and think that somehow things are going to get better. Handing someone a group of 40 spreadsheets that have 60 crosstabs on them is not likely to lead to an outcome, right? By the way, most people don't process data and quantitative information very well from tables. Very few people actually do that. So one of the things that when I have more time, I talk about visualizations being very important. Gabe's had some good ones in his area, and I think we've worked on this too. The idea of data visualization is incredibly important. If you want people to actually explore and understand data, it needs to be visual. It can't be a series of tables you just hand to someone. So let's talk a little bit about this. The point we're trying to make here is this is about dialogue. This is the use of data for improvement is not about the data. It's about how you talk about the data and then translate it into action. Because the other thing we're fond of doing, by the way, we talk about things a lot. We'll explore something when we actually get to that point. But very rarely do we actually then take that and move it to action. So I think what the call from CBD and other initiatives like that is to try to basically marry your expertise that you have with some data you ask about student success and try to move forward on it. The other thing when I have more time I go into is to talk about the fact that our inquiry and our data in most colleges has historically been very rarely about student outcomes. What's the one piece of data every dean knows or department chair knows on a community college campus? FTEs. What kind of questions do we spend our institutional resources answering? It's things like FTEs, productivity, funding, and by the way, those things are incredibly important. We need to be efficient as colleges to actually run, but somewhere along the line, maybe we got lost a little bit to the idea that running the college efficiently is only useful if it actually helps us create stronger outcomes for students, right? Running a college efficiently is not an end in itself unless your goal in college, this is an open question, by the way, what the goal of colleges are. If the goal in college is to keep the college running, then a focus 100% on efficiency is what you do. It's a very industrial model. If the idea of college is actually to create systems and structures to improve outcomes, we might want to think about looking at those outcomes and talking about what's going on there. And it sounds subtle, but it's not. If you ask yourself, this question I ask folks, when was the last time, and you guys are pretty progressive in North Carolina, when was the last time you sat in a standing department meeting or committee meeting on your campus, and you got a key piece of student success data that you explored with your peers for more than 20 minutes? When was the last time did anyone have that, how many of you had that happen in the last 6 months? This is the number of hands this is the best number of hands you usually get in the room. The average number of hands you get when I ask this question is about 5% of us. And that's not a gotcha, it's not saying to be shamed by this. It's just the point is, the course of doing business at the college is not to get together, unless you change something, to sit down and explore these questions. And very rarely does it happen on our campuses unless we specifically create and this is what I say to all you presidents and provosts in the room, and I've been a provost. This comes down to creating the time and space for this to happen. Right? The time and space does not exist right now on our campuses. This is a huge challenge. I'm not saying this is easy. But the idea is we actually have to set up these structures. My analysis of the completion by design planning year, the single most important thing that we gave folks in the planning year and completion by design was we forced them, but they came willingly because they liked us, but we forced them to have the time and space to actually think about that data we just shared with you and the next 10 research questions that came after it. Clark's here from Gopher Tech. This is, by the way, this conversation is often most difficult for the researcher who's going to end up asking a lot more research questions that are really focused on student success. By the way, most IR people want to answer those questions, would rather be doing that than more enrollment reports. But this issue we gave people was time and space to look at this stuff over a year. And so you're getting a modeled version of that. Yes, it's light. You don't have a year. You're getting an hour and a half. It's better than nothing. Right? It's a start of a longer process, right? All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the framework. I want to do one quick thing before I move on here, and it's actually show you some data that kind of isn't, I'm not saying run this study and it's the only study you should ever run, but it's a study that I found really useful to make this point about exploring data. So the stages of our, the applied inquiry framework that we helped create, the idea is that we actually have to explore how to improve outcomes. We gather meaningful evidence, we discuss it broadly, we use it to inform change, measure the impact. Not rocket science here, this looks like most quality improvement type models. But one thing I would say, if you look at what we've done in the last 10 years, for the most part, we've done this. Gather evidence. I skipped meaningful for a reason. We've gathered evidence for the last 10 years. That's what we've done. We've done a great job. 10 years ago, no one had any idea what the data was on many of these key outcomes. We've gathered a lot of evidence, but this evidence has not sat in a larger context of improvement. It's mainly just sat. Right? It hasn't been situated where we've actually done a lot with it. So I'm going to come down into this stage pretty quickly here because I want to show you this one set of data that I think makes this point. I love this next slide. Make sure you're focusing on the right data. So I'm going to show you now a 20-year history in the entire California community college system of course success rates. What's happened in 20 years? Right here. What's happened in 20 years? Nothing. All right? Now hold on a sec. We'll play the spin game. Is this give me a couple ways this could be a positive outcome. Didn't get worse? What's some other ones? Funding's gone down. Kathleen, what else? We have more at-risk students. That one's interesting, Kathleen, actually, because when you look at the data on it, that we have more at-risk students than we did 20 years ago, if you go back 20 years, those of us who have had dev ed data for 20 years, placement rates are actually the same as they were 20 years ago. We just focus on them more now, right, in many of our colleges. Right? And by the way, part of the reason that's true is because we've changed the cut scores every 6 months for the last 20 years. By the way, how many of you have, before this recently, actually reduced your cut scores for entry into a transfer level course? Has anyone in this room actually done that over time at your college? That never happens. We've increasingly, by the way, made it harder for students to get into transfer level courses, and the data, and you guys are part of a grand Petri dish experiment here, by the way, on this, which I will say, as I've said in every room in North Carolina or anyone I've talked to in the last 3 years, what you are doing with the multiple measures placement is guaranteed to work. It is absolutely going to get more students through, and you're going to have more students completing transfer level math and English in 2 years, and it's going to be a model for the rest of the country. Just for some second on that one issue, Statway, Quantway data, just one kind of small way of looking at it. The baseline rate of students getting through transfer level math from two or three levels below hovers in the 15 to 20% range. In Statway, Quantway, that's over 3 years they get through transfer level math. In Statway, Quantway, after 1 year, it's close to 53%. Other acceleration projects have found the same goal. The one piece of data, if you don't know it, check out the story at Long Beach City College. Long Beach City College has a program called STEPS, which, independent of all the CCREC research on multiple measures, they did this same thing you were doing, essentially. They're using high school transcript data. They were about to raise their cut score for the 7th time in 10 years in English. That sounds like it should be a crazy story, but I've heard this happen. So only 10% of their new entering students from the Long Beach High School District were going to be in transfer level English, right? They ran this algorithm that's a little different than the one that you guys are using here. Yours is a little more discrete. We're just saying 2.6 GPA. But they based it on a number of factors, and they ended up getting a group of students who had the same predicted level of success in transfer level English, but it was 5 times as many students, over 50%. And so the interesting part of this story to me, being from California, because not a lot of this happens, they actually did it. Last fall 2012, they put over 50% of their students in transfer level English. They do a couple of things around it. They structured some student support. What do you think happened to the overall success rate in their English course? Used to be 57%. What was it after the year where they put nearly 6 times as many students in? Went down 0.8% to 56.2. So in one course, they went from a model that got somewhere between 30 and 40% through over a couple of years to getting more than that through in one semester. So again, that doesn't diminish the challenge we now have in math and English classrooms. It's changed, right? We used to severely underplace students. We know this from the CCRC research. We now may have some students who are overplaced. We need to figure out how to deal with that. But I would not be worried if I were you that this is not going to work as far as the numbers and the data look. Sorry, I get off on the sides, and that was an important one, because I want you guys to not be worried about that. Now, you may be worried about your math faculty talking about their class to you. That'll be different. The importance of this one, by the way, is nothing's changed in the last 20 years. And, by the way, there's also a way to spin this negatively, of course, which is we've put a lot of time and effort, or we've thought we've had, into improving success rates, say, across the campus. And we haven't seen a whole lot of change. Now, Davis and others, I think of us, would say one of the reasons for that is most of those, by the way, innovation exists right now on every one of your campuses. You all have your unique evolutionary trajectory of innovation. But one question I would ask is, what percentage of your student population does that innovation serve? We have a lot of programs on our campuses that serve 30, 50, and 70 people. And most of your campuses have 5 to 10,000 students on them. So we haven't done a lot at scale, and that's part of what we try to do in completion by design, think about redesign at scale. It's tougher to redesign at scale, but if you really want to move the needles on some of these numbers, especially the ones that David had earlier, we're going to have to do things more at scale. All right, now we're discussing evidence broadly. Okay, so now we're actually getting together. Data don't speak for themselves, right? So this is next, I'm going to show you some data that kind of visualize the idea that data don't speak for themselves. So we actually have to have time and space to explore them. We need skilled facilitation. Our folks at Public Agenda help us with this. And multiple perspectives are often needed. And there's a key epiphany that comes from this study I'm about to show you. And I was in a room a little smaller than this at a college where I presented the data, and the epiphany came from the lowest paid person in the room. It was a financial aid tech one who raised her hand in the back and said, hey, what about X? And I had the data and was ready to plant what X was on the next slide, but she asked the question. And the point here is we actually need a full range of people. Who knows our students better on the ground than line faculty, part-time and full-time faculty, and the student services professionals who wrestle with the issues that are preventing them from getting toward success. Those of us who are administrators need to keep in mind that we don't often see students on the ground quite as often as those faculty and student services professors. That doesn't mean we transfer all the power over to them, but that collectively we have to have these discussions. So here's a study. All right, I do this thing called 3 studies to energize a campus conversation. These first 2 are very cool, but we're not doing them. This third one, I'll share with you guys all the slides and all these things if you want them. Levels of preparedness in GE courses. So as is the case, I think, in North Carolina, many of our courses in California, our big GE courses, don't have strong prerequisites. Okay, so many of them don't have any prerequisites. And there was this huge debate a couple years ago in California. We had 2 requirements to put on a prerequisite in California until 2 years ago. One was that the content had to make sense, kind of content validity. Yes, you do need English to write 20-page history papers. You needed that story. You also had to have some data suggesting that students actually did need this prerequisite you're going to put on to succeed in the class at higher levels than other students. And so, largely because either I was the myth buster or someone they just wanted to annoy other people, they asked me to share some statewide data on this question. So what I did is looked at this classic question of what happens when you look at success rates in GE courses based on math and English level. Okay. One backdrop to this is I look at them simultaneously enrolled, because those researchers and people familiar with your database in the room know that the most unclean database on your campus is the placement database. Always has been, always will be. It's not meant to be a research database. It's meant to be operational. It's constantly overwriting itself. People take multiple placement tests. Counselors place students. Students magically show up in the next course without doing anything happening. It's just a mess, right? It happens everywhere. It's not just you. It's okay. So what I do is I look at students who are if you don't have prerequisites, by the way, you have lots of students who are simultaneously enrolled in math or English in a GE course. Look, not all of them in any given semester. If you look over time, you get enough of these. So this is a situation where I'm looking at Psych 1. Any Psych instructors in the room? All right, we got some of us. Me too. All right. Clark, I've used you before, so I won't use you this time. We're looking at what the success rate is for students at this college, where 2 levels below in English, 1 level below, transfer A, transfer B. So how do students do in Psych 1? First of all, we can see in any given, this is over a 10-year period, students taking it, there's about a third of the students in any given semester who are taking Psych 1 and an English course at the same time, right? And the good news is there's not a lot of students 2 levels below at this college taking Psych courses, but there's enough because I have a big enough sample size here to do this study. So we get, when we look at this data, what you might expect to get, which is, all right, students who are at the Transfer B course, they do really well. Transfer A course do pretty well. You drop to 1 below, the success rate drops 20 points. You drop to 2 below, the success rate drops into the 30s. So what does everyone reasonably conclude that we should do at this point in terms of prerequisites? Looking just at this piece of data. We need to set a prerequisite for eligibility for English 1A for Psych 1. And by the way, that's a perfectly worthwhile interpretation of this data. Okay, so I'm in that room. I said, what else do people think? I had a lot longer to do this. So I said, what else do you think is causing this type? What else could explain this relationship? So we had a little bit of conversation, and this woman raises her hand in the back and goes, you know, this is really interesting, Rob, but what about the relationship between math and Psych 100? Good question. We'll take a look at that. I had the next slide, but here it is. Let's look at math. So what do we see when we look at math? So here's the transfer level. Now you have 3 below. We see when they're at transfer level math, about the same ratios here. 76%. Let's see. That look familiar to anyone? Okay, now what? Add math as a prerequisite. Yeah, you always can get someone to say that. She's saying it and laughing, by the way. You get in the right rooms, no one's laughing when they say that. We need both English and math as prerequisites for Psych 100. So what explains this finding? I ask this every time I present. What do you think's going on here? Why is math equally predictive of success in Psych 100 as English? Say it. Academic preparedness in general. So we're talking about general academic preparedness. What are some other reasons? There's about 10 of them that I've heard. Throw them out. What are some other reasons that might explain this? Motivation. There's about 5 non-cognitive reasons that come up here. Motivation being one, confidence being another, hope, social capital, productive persistence, grit. There's a lot going on there. But what you get is this is essentially a survival analysis, is what you've done here. What you've done actually, because remember, until recently, we have long dev ed sequences. And not many people survive them, right? We know very few people survive our dev ed sequence. So what we've actually done here by looking at this is we got those who actually survived our dev ed sequence. Man, they are survivors. They can pass anything. They passed our dev ed sequence, right? It's an interesting hypothesis. By the way, there's no right or wrong answer here. But the point is, when you or anyone else looks at this slide and you actually take the time to think about what's going on, you're going to get about 10 different answers. Another one, by the way, is life events. The same life events that make it difficult for someone to pass transfer level math and English may make it difficult for them to pass the other course. You know, I think the non-cognitive ones are pretty powerful. And one of the reasons I show this slide is, again, I ask the question, what have we let be the arbiter of whether you are transfer ready or not? Transfer level courses, math and English. And we have assumed, by the way, when we do that, that it's about math and it's about English. And I think what this suggests, to me at least, is while those are predictive of what's actually needed to succeed, it may not be the math and English itself, right? And to further make this point, I'll show you one more set of slides, then we'll move on, which is now I did it for all of the 10 top enrolled GE courses at this college, just to show it's not just psych. So I did it for speech, for econ, for history, this is health science. And you see a range of the courses have different levels of success, right? So there's going to be a range here. Some of the green bars are a little weird because they get really small in a couple of these. History 101 is not a very popular course at this college. I thought it was a great course, history instructors, but it's just not popular. So then I stop on this slide for a second. Some of you have seen this slide before, so you are exempt from this next question. What is interesting about this particular slide when you take a look at it for a second? Is there something that jumps out at you here? All right, Fitness 334. Okay, so this is California Community College. It's time to play Northern California stereotypes. Okay, it's a very fun game. It's in basic cable, but it's still fun. Northern California stereotypes. What 2 courses prototypically will I get as answers when I say, what fitness course is this in Northern California? Surfing and yoga. Rock climbing is the 3rd one I get. I get rock climbing and skiing tied for 3rd. Surfing and yoga. This unnamed California college at least I used to work, which tells you what it is. This course is yoga. It is not a critical study of yoga from 1220 to 1440, selected readings, right? This is not write me a 20-page paper about what it's like to be on a yoga mat. This is get out the yoga mat. It's an activity-based fitness course. And what do you see in this course? It's almost like I made that up. I checked this 7 times because I couldn't believe it actually was the same. It's exactly the same relationship. Right? So now what? Wow, I don't know what the answer is here, but I do think this suggests that it's probably not about math or English development in yoga. What's going on here and how amazingly consistent it is across the board means that something else is really going on here. And what I worry about, and by the way, this doesn't mean that you couldn't put a math and English prerequisite on any of these courses and it wouldn't work. It'll work if what you're trying to do is improve the success rate in that other course and they don't care about why. right? It's the same thing with your cut score issue, right? If you make your cut score 98 out of 100, all 2 people who get through will do really well in the class, right? This is a version of the same thing. We've essentially done the same thing here with prerequisites, by the way, which is, okay, if you survive our math or English sequence, then yeah, you can take these courses. But I think the issue here is what I worry about. And this is the reason I even mention this study is because I think it's unpacking this type of question that's going to help us answer how do we move completion rates. Because we're not focusing on what may be the real issues, which are things like the non-cognitive factors, financial aid status, study skills, life skills, some combination of those other things here. And so when people mess with this and go to the next level, they say, what about X, Y, and Z? And there, by the way, are some pretty good emerging, CCRC and some other folks, pretty good emerging simple assessments for some of these non-cognitive areas, like hope and motivation and confidence, that we might be able to use. And the question I ask us is, where do we develop those skills? Where in our, it's the same question I ask when people say critical thinking is an institutional learning outcome, which we all, every single one of you who have institutional learning outcomes has critical thinking as one of them. I ask the same question here, where is critical thinking actually taught explicitly in your curriculum? Everyone raises their hand and says, it's taught, we teach that. I have an assignment where people think critically, but it's not taught explicitly. When you talk to employers afterwards from both your CTE and Gen Ed programs, what do they complain about? Critical thinking, problem solving, and communication, right? My worry here is when you focus on the content, we're missing the whole student issue, right? And I think this data suggests, and I don't have the answer which of those it is, but the point here is looking at data in a little bit different way, and another point is asking the second and third level questions. We could have stopped here. And by the way, 9 times out of 10 or 98 times out of 100 when we do this analysis, we stop here. We take the simple answer, which is, sweet, we like success. We want success rates to be higher in that course. Let's put a prerequisite on it. We don't ask the question of why this is happening. And by the way, the other question we don't answer is who's being affected by this new prerequisite? Because I guarantee you, when you actually look at it, you got a pretty big equity issue on your hands. You're going to be keeping out many of the very students that we have demonstrated structures can help get through. And when we do this, some of them we're dooming to a dev ed sequence that we know doesn't work. By the way, there's a hypothesis out there that this is all about Instructor. And we find this, obviously it's related to a number of things, but the single best predictor of a course success rate in any community college in this country is Instructor. And yes, and so what I did here is I picked the 10 most highly enrolled GE courses. So I did it, most of these are, by the way, broad enough that they all have multiple instructors. But it's a great point. When you look at, I remember my old psych department, because I was actually provost and teaching part-time so I could look at the data. It's very unethical, but I did it anyway. I looked at all 7 instructors in psych and I looked at their average course success rate. It ranged from 83 to 38. And the proportion of A's between the top and bottom students, the top instructor gave 80% A's, 10% B's, 10% C's. The bottom, it was the other way, 10, 80, 10, 10, 80. And by the way, I'm not saying which one of them was right or wrong or who was learning more in any of those courses, but I do know that the only students who know that are the ones who actually don't need to know that. Like the students who already are going to be successful are the ones who know who the easy instructors are. So one of the things that happens is the students who don't have those systems available to them end up with the harder instructors and they fail more. Right? So there's a lot of tough issues around this. It's a great question, and I think that is also part of this, right? Is dealing with the issue of what actually happens in the 4 walls of the classroom. So the point of all of this, aside from I like this study, which is, a good point, is that this is the type of thing we need to do to unpack those completion rates. When you think about student progress and the idea of things like prerequisites or other policies you have, you're going to engage in some activities tomorrow where you're looking at what do you think the key loss points are for your students? What do you think some momentum points might be? You may need to, you're not going to solve those tomorrow, right? You're going to start a process where you start thinking about where are the barriers in front of our students and how do we help remove those? Some of those barriers are structural, some of them are process, some of them deal with policy, some of them deal with student services. But in looking at data this way and really unpacking it, you can't unpack every research question you ask with 5 levels or you'd never actually do anything. But thinking about where the more important ones are and where, with your knowledge of leverage and impact, as long as you keep those things in your forefront, it's critically important. One of the key points of this when we get to step 4 is not to just engage in this cycle of continually asking questions, getting data, asking more questions, and never doing anything with it. Right? When we do get to that stage, this notion of, this was an industry term, but paralysis by analysis, kind of trite, but there's a lot of places that get stuck here, who could collect reams and reams of data and think that there's going to be some absolute answer they're magically going to find somewhere. There is no absolute answer. There is no silver bullet. This stuff's complicated. The best studies we run nationally, in only rare cases, are double-blind randomized studies. We don't know the single biggest factor when we isolate all other factors. We can do some of the quant folks in the room can do a pretty good job at isolating factors with regressions and other statistical approaches. But this whole idea that we're going to somehow find the absolute truth and there's going to be one thing that changes everything, it isn't going to happen. If we're waiting for that, we're going to be waiting a long time. So the question is, what do you do when the evidence is ambiguous? And by the way, it's always ambiguous in this world. One thing we can do with asking research questions is we might be able to eliminate a number of solutions. And I think essentially that's what we've done in completion by design. With these design principles that we're going to talk about tomorrow, is we basically said, with what we know from the educational research, from the economics research, from the psych research, here's what we think is our best bet of a series of design principles you can use, married with your expertise at the campus, to move this forward. Because at the end of the day, you're going to reach the limits of the data pretty quickly when you get there. Hey, you got to trust your expertise and choose. This, by the way, is a very energizing message for faculty. Most faculty who aren't asked about these issues to begin with, and are also not asked to bring to the table, what do you think about this? How can we help move this forward? And at some point, you got to try something, right? And as I've been known to joke about on the dev ed side, if you're trying to redesign dev ed math starting 3 levels below, try anything. Because right now, I bet you could get the same number of students through with a moat around the campus and a dragon in it. Because if there's only 10% getting through, we could do that without the classes. Innovate away. It's fine, right? It's a little sad, but it's fine. And by the way, none of this is saying that what you've been doing up to this point is wrong. You've done it all wrong. It's what's just evolved over basically 400 years of a higher education paradigm that's never changed. The classroom that exists today, it's changing now more rapidly than it ever has, is pretty much the same classroom that existed in Oxford in 1650. And at that point, the system was designed to serve the ruling class, and it didn't matter what happened to them. We're serving the top 100% of our high school graduating class. Right? It's a different model. We've democratized higher education. We haven't changed our structures any. What we use to track the data in CBD are things like, they're based on research by CCRC and others, they're based on the lost momentum framework, things like percentage of students coming from high school that place below college level, right? We like to say we don't control this. There's a question whether we actually have a little more control over this than we have, because we're actually the ones setting the placement rules, right? You guys are already changing this, so I'm not too worried about this one. Percentage of students who actually complete remediation within 1 year or pass transfer level math and English within 2 years. These are pretty critical, right? Progress toward the degree, even at the entry stage. We've also added some one-semester KPIs, because one of the problems with looking over at those completion data Davis had is it's now fall 2013 and the CBD schools are in kind of CBD light of their implementation. It'll be starting more in fall 14. We'll get our first 5-year completion data in spring of 18. It's a long time to wait for feedback, right? So we have some of these things that are a little more, they're predictive of those long-term KPIs. But things like, we always look at persistence rates, but these are pretty good ones within a semester. How many of your entering students this fall will accumulate six or more transfer units? I'm guessing it's not as big of a number as you might think. And that's a number we can try to move over time. So we're going to end up giving you guys data on, and if I miss this up, Bill, let me know. In your next session, you will see data on first to second semester, or is it fall to fall? Cool, you'll see both. You'll see your college data on this, and you'll see your college data, is it 12 or 24 college credits? You'll see both of these. And the big one is you're going to see this, which I call the super KPI, because at the end of the day, all these other ones are in service of that last one, which is overall, what's your completion rate at the KPIs? And you're going to get a chance to explore this data. We'll set up the breakout a little more when you get there. But I again urge you, like we said at the start, your initial inclination is going to be to compare it to the overall average and see your rank. And whether you're at 31% or 34% on a metric has a lot to do with the rest of that, and it certainly has to do with how you're trying to improve things, but I wouldn't get bogged down in the rank. What you want to do is focus more on the actual metric itself and how it can move over time. And so we'll come back and talk a little more. I will get you guys these PowerPoints, but at the end of the day, that we are trying to use this unpacking of the data as the first step of a change process. that we'll talk a lot more about. So we're really modeling what we did in the CBD planning year. We spent a lot of time up front on the data. Then we talked a lot about engagement strategies, which you're going to hear about. We looked at the loss momentum framework. We talked about policy. We talked about the design principles. You're going to do all this in a mini version in the next 2 days. This is the last time you'll listen to a long session like this. We wanted to kind of set the table. I want to share with you, I remain incredibly optimistic and excited about this work and this initiative. And as I said with your placement test, I do firmly believe that in 5 years, the experience of our students could be very different than what it is now, and it will result in more of them completing. I think we are on that path. I applaud North Carolina for the work they've done on the scaling so far. You know, the existence of the 2.0 and this institute is a huge step forward. You know, Ohio's got other plans in place to do the same thing. And I get the opportunity to share this nationally with folks, and I talk about you guys a lot here in North Carolina, about what you're already doing, and you're doing this against a backdrop of some pretty impressive and big policy changes as well. So there's a lot of great stuff to work from here. It's all challenging to keep it all together. The last thing I'll say is, what we're not asking you to do is start over. This is not about everything you've done up to this point stopping and you're going to go 180 degrees in just a different direction. It's about taking what you've learned to this point, maybe marrying it with a slightly different way of thinking about things, and you decide how to move forward. Knowing your own trajectories, we'll share with you the loss momentum framework and the design principles tomorrow morning. And at the end of that, you'll be moving down a path to where you can kind of marry that expertise and some of these frameworks to move things forward on your campus. So keep that mission from those videos. It's in our hands to have more of those stories, less of the hard parts of the stories, more of the successful part. One of the things you have to believe to do this work is that we own this. This is about us. This is not about getting better students, fixing the student. We've been talking about that for decades. This is about what we can do to change this, and I think you will see that we can do a lot. So thank you for your time, and we'll be looking forward to the breakouts.